The gunshot that rang out across the dusty street of Telluride, Colorado, wasn't meant for her. But Beatrice Garrett still flinched as she stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the general store, clutching a bolt of fabric against her chest. It was late spring in 1884, and the mining town was bustling with prospectors, gamblers, and men looking to strike it rich in the San Juan Mountains. The shot had come from the saloon down the street, just another Saturday afternoon in a place where justice was swift and tempers were shorter. She steadied her breathing and continued walking toward her family's modest home on the edge of town, her boots clicking against the weathered planks. At 22 years old, Beatrice had lived in Telluride for 3 years now, ever since her father had dragged the family out from Kansas City with dreams of opening a successful dry goods store. Those dreams had materialized, but they'd come with a price she was only now beginning to fully understand. Her father, Harold Garrett, had borrowed money from one of the wealthiest men in town to get his store up and running. That man was Vincent Blackthorne, a mine owner in his late 40s who controlled much of the silver operations in the area. The debt had grown over the years, despite the store's moderate success, and 6 months ago, Vincent had proposed a solution that had made Beatrice's blood run cold. He would forgive the entire debt if she agreed to become his wife. Her father had accepted before she could even voice an objection. Now, as summer approached, the wedding was set for late June, just 6 weeks away. 6 weeks until she would stand in the small church and promise herself to a man she didn't love, a man whose cold eyes and calculating smile made her skin crawl. Vincent was polite enough in public, but there was something predatory about the way he looked at her, as if she were just another asset he'd acquired. Beatrice reached her house and pushed through the front door, setting the fabric down on the kitchen table where her mother, Margaret, was peeling potatoes for dinner. "Did you get everything we needed?" her mother asked without looking up. "Yes, Mama. Good. Mr. Blackthorne will be joining us for dinner tomorrow evening. Make sure you wear the blue dress he likes." Beatrice's jaw tightened, but she nodded. There was no point in arguing anymore. She tried that months ago, had pleaded with her father to find another way, had even offered to take a job herself to help pay off the debt. But Harold Garrett was a proud man, and in his mind, this arrangement solved all their problems. His daughter would marry into wealth and security, and his debt would be cleared. What more could anyone want? That night, Beatrice lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of Telluride settling down for the evening. Music still drifted from the saloons, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. She thought about her life, about the future that had been decided for her without her consent. She'd never had the chance to choose anything for herself. Even coming to Colorado had been her father's decision. What did she want? The question felt almost foreign. She'd spent so long doing what was expected, being the dutiful daughter, that she'd never stopped to consider her own desires. But now, lying in the darkness with her wedding date approaching like an executioner's axe, she couldn't avoid it any longer. She wanted freedom. She wanted to make her own choices. She wanted to wake up each morning without dread pooling in her stomach. And maybe, somewhere deep in her heart, she wanted to know what it felt like to be loved by someone who chose her, not someone who'd purchased her like a piece of property. But those were just dreams, and dreams didn't pay debts. The next morning, Beatrice woke early and helped her mother prepare the house for Vincent's visit. They cleaned and cooked, and by the time the sun began its descent toward the mountains, the house smelled of roasted chicken and fresh bread. Beatrice changed into the blue dress, a gift from Vincent that fit perfectly but felt like a costume she was forced to wear. Vincent arrived precisely at 6 o'clock, as punctual as always. He was a tall man with graying hair slicked back from his forehead, dressed in an expensive suit that looked out of place in the rough mining town. He brought flowers for Margaret and a bottle of whiskey for Harold, playing the role of the generous benefactor with practiced ease. During dinner, Vincent dominated the conversation, talking about his mining operations and his plans to expand. He barely looked at Beatrice, but when he did, his gaze was possessive. She was already his in his mind, a deal closed and waiting only for the formality of vows. "I've been thinking," Vincent said as Margaret served coffee, "that after the wedding, Beatrice and I should take a trip to Denver, a proper honeymoon. I have business there anyway, and she should see something beyond this little town." "That sounds wonderful," Harold said enthusiastically. "Doesn't it, Beatrice?" She forced a smile. "Very generous. You'll need to get used to a different kind of life," Vincent continued, finally addressing her directly. "A wife of my standing has certain responsibilities. There will be social events, entertaining important guests." "I trust you're prepared for that. I'll do my best," Beatrice said, her voice flat. Vincent's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he'd caught the lack of enthusiasm in her tone, but he said nothing. After coffee, he left with promises to see them at church on Sunday, and Beatrice finally allowed herself to breathe. That night, unable to sleep again, she made a decision. She needed to get out of the house, to feel something other than these four walls closing in on her. She dressed quietly and slipped out through the kitchen door, walking through the empty streets toward the edge of town. The moon was bright enough to light her way, and she found herself drawn toward the open land beyond the last buildings. There was a small creek that ran down from the mountains, and she'd discovered it shortly after arriving in Telluride. It had become her private sanctuary, a place where she could think without her parents hovering or Vincent's plans suffocating her. She settled onto a large rock near the water's edge and let the sound of the current wash over her. She didn't know how long she sat there before she heard the horse approaching. Her head snapped up, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was out here alone in the darkness. A rider emerged from the shadows, and in the moonlight she could make out a tall figure on a dark horse. "Didn't expect to find anyone out here this time of night," a man's voice called out. It was rough but not unkind. Beatrice stood quickly, ready to run if necessary. "I could say the same." The rider came closer, and she could see him better now. He was young, probably around her age or a few years older, with sun-darkened skin and light brown hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore dusty trail clothes and had a worn hat pulled low over his eyes. There was something open about his face, honest, that made her relax slightly. "Didn't mean to startle you, miss," he said, tipping his hat. "Name's Wade Morrison. Just rode in from Wyoming looking for work at one of the mines." "Beatrice Garrett," she replied, still wary but less frightened. "You shouldn't sneak up on people." "Wasn't sneaking. You were just lost in thought." He dismounted and led his horse toward the creek to drink. "This your land?" "No, just a place I come sometimes." Wade nodded, studying her in the moonlight. "Seems like a peaceful spot." "Must be something heavy on your mind to bring you out here alone at night." Beatrice bristled at the observation. "That's not really your concern." "Fair enough." He didn't seem offended, just thoughtful. "But if you're going to be out here, you should know there were some rough types camped about a mile back. Saw them on my way in. Might not be safe for a lady alone. I can take care of myself." "I don't doubt it. Still, wouldn't hurt to be careful." They stood in silence for a moment, the creek babbling between them. Beatrice knew she should leave, should head back to town, but something kept her rooted there. Maybe it was the fact that this stranger didn't know anything about her engagement or her father's debt. To him, she was just a woman by a creek, not a commodity being traded to settle accounts. "What brings you to Telluride?" she asked finally. Heard there was work. Spent the last few years working cattle ranches up north, but figured I'd try something different. Mining pays better, or so they say. It's hard work, dangerous too. Most things worth doing are. Wade looked at her with curiosity. You grew up here, Kansas City originally. My father opened a store here 3 years ago. You like it? The mountains and all. Beatrice considered the question. I did at first. The landscape is beautiful, but sometimes I feel like the mountains are walls keeping me trapped. Wade tilted his head. That's an interesting way to see it. Most folks feel freed by open land. I suppose it depends on what you're running from, or what you're stuck with. There was something in her voice that made Wade pause. He took a step closer, his expression softening. You all right, Miss Garrett? The genuine concern in his question caught her off guard. When was the last time someone had asked her that and actually wanted to know the answer? Not her mother, who was too focused on propriety. Not her father, who only saw her as a solution to his problems. Certainly not Vincent, who saw her as an acquisition. I'm fine, she lied. Wade didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. Well, I should probably let you get back. It's late and, like I said, not the safest time to be out. You're out here too. I've got a horse and a rifle, and I'm not from around here, so nobody would miss me much if something happened. That's a sad way to think about it, Wade shrugged. Just being practical. But I imagine there are folks who'd miss you plenty. Beatrice thought about her parents, about how their concern for her had everything to do with their own welfare and nothing to do with her happiness. Maybe, she said quietly. Something in her tone must have conveyed more than she intended, because Wade's expression grew more serious. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he mounted his horse again and looked down at her. If you're ever out here again and need someone to make sure you get home safe, I'll likely be around. Probably getting a room at the boarding house on 3rd Street once I find work. I don't need a protector. Didn't say you did. Just offering. He tipped his hat again. Good night, Miss Garrett. He rode off toward town, leaving Beatrice alone by the creek once more. She stood there for another few minutes, thinking about the strange encounter. There had been something refreshing about talking to Wade Morrison, about being treated like a person rather than a prize or a burden. It was a small thing, but it stirred something in her chest, a reminder that there were still people in the world who saw her as human. Finally, she made her way back to town, slipping into her house as quietly as she'd left. As she lay in bed, she found herself thinking not about Vincent or the wedding, but about a cowboy with kind eyes who'd offered help without expecting anything in return. The next few days passed in the usual routine. Beatrice helped at the store, endured her mother's endless wedding preparations, and tried not to think about her rapidly approaching wedding date. On Wednesday, she was arranging canned goods on a shelf when the bell above the door chimed. She turned to greet the customer and felt a jolt of surprise when she saw Wade Morrison standing just inside the entrance. He looked cleaner than he had by the creek, his hair combed back and his clothes less dusty, though still clearly those of a working man. "Morning," he said with a slight smile. "Didn't realize this was your family store." "Good morning," Beatrice replied, very aware that her mother was in the back room and might appear at any moment. "Did you find work?" "I did. Started at the Emerald Mine yesterday. Foreman said they needed strong backs, and I qualified." He approached the counter. "Figured I'd pick up some supplies. Need coffee, beans, and whatever you'd recommend for someone living in a boarding house with minimal cooking facilities." Beatrice moved behind the counter, grateful to have a task to focus on. "Dried meat, hardtack, maybe some canned peaches if you want something less monotonous." "Sounds good. I'll take your recommendations." As she gathered the items, she could feel his eyes on her, not in the uncomfortable way Vincent looked at her, but with genuine interest. It made her self-conscious in a different way, made her aware of the flour dust on her apron and the loose strand of hair falling across her forehead. "How are you finding Telluride so far?" she asked, keeping her voice professional. "It's all right. Rough town, but I've seen rougher. People seem decent enough mostly, though I've already learned who to avoid." "Oh." "Fellow named Blackthorn seems to own half the town, including the mine where I'm working. Men at the boarding house say he's not someone to cross." Beatrice's hand stilled for just a moment before she continued wrapping his purchases. "That's accurate advice." Wade must have caught something in her tone because his next words were careful. "You know him." Before she could answer, her mother emerged from the back room. Margaret's eyes swept over Wade with the assessing gaze she used on all unfamiliar men, categorizing him immediately as a laborer, someone below their social station, now that they were about to be connected to Vincent Blackthorn. "Beatrice, don't forget you have a fitting at 2 o'clock, she said, her voice pointed. "For your wedding dress." The words hung in the air like a pronouncement. Beatrice saw Wade's expression shift, something closing off behind his eyes. He nodded politely to Margaret, then looked back at Beatrice. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "Didn't realize you were engaged." "Thank you," Beatrice replied automatically, hating the words even as they left her mouth. Wade paid for his supplies quickly after that, his demeanor still friendly but more distant. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. "Thanks for the recommendations, Miss Garrett. I hope you'll be very happy." Then he was gone, and Beatrice felt an unexpected weight settle in her chest. Her mother immediately launched into a lecture about being too familiar with customers, especially working men who were beneath their station. But Beatrice barely heard her. She kept thinking about the way Wade's expression had changed when he'd learned about her engagement, as if a door had closed between them. Why did she care? She'd only met him once before, had barely spoken to him. He was just a cowboy turned miner, passing through her life like so many others in this transient town. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just slipped away. The dress fitting that afternoon was torture. The seamstress, a cheerful woman named Mrs. Patterson, kept exclaiming over how beautiful Beatrice would look, how lucky she was to be marrying such a successful man. Beatrice stood on a small platform while Mrs. Patterson pinned and tucked the white fabric, creating a gown that felt more like a burial shroud than a wedding dress. "You seem a bit melancholy, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice gentle. "Wedding nerves, something like that. Perfectly natural. Every bride feels some anxiety, but once you're married, you'll wonder what you were worried about." Beatrice doubted that very much but said nothing. She looked at herself in the mirror at this stranger in white and felt completely disconnected from her own reflection. This wasn't her life. It couldn't be. And yet, in 6 weeks, this would become her reality. That evening, she found herself back at the creek. She knew it was foolish, knew she was tempting fate by continuing to slip out alone, but she needed the solitude, the space to breathe and think. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple, and for a moment she let herself pretend she was anywhere but here, anyone but herself. She heard the horse before she saw it and knew without looking who it was. Wade appeared from the tree line, his expression unsurprised to find her there. "Figured I might find you here," he said, dismounting. "Hope you don't mind. It's not my creek." "No, but it seems to be your place." He came closer but maintained a respectful distance. "I've been thinking about what happened today at the store, about what your mother said." Beatrice stiffened. "I don't see how my engagement is any of your business." "It's not," Wade agreed. "But I've been thinking about what you said the other night about feeling trapped. And today, when your mother mentioned your wedding, You looked like someone being led to the gallows. You don't know anything about my situation. You're right, I don't. But I know what I see, and I see a woman who doesn't want to get married. Beatrice turned away from him, her throat tight. What I want doesn't matter. Why not? The simple question, asked with such genuine confusion, nearly broke her. Because my father owes money, a lot of money. And the man I'm marrying, Vincent Blackthorne, has agreed to forgive the debt in exchange for my hand. If I refuse, my family loses everything. Wade was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. Blackthorne, the mine owner. Yes. The man who's old enough to be your father. Yes. And you're just going to go through with it. Let yourself be sold like livestock. Beatrice spun to face him, anger flashing in her eyes. What choice do I have? Run away? Leave my parents destitute? I'm all they have. My younger brother died of fever 2 years ago. If I refuse this marriage, they'll lose their store, their home, everything they've worked for. I can't do that to them. Even if it means sacrificing your own life. My comfort isn't more important than their survival. Wade shook his head slowly. That's where you're wrong. Your life, your happiness, it matters just as much as theirs. Maybe more because it's yours to live. That's easy to say when you're free to drift from town to town, working where you please, answering to no one. But I'm a woman. I don't have those options. Maybe you have more options than you think. Like what? Become a saloon girl, a laundress. Even if I could find work that paid enough to support myself, the shame would destroy my parents anyway. At least this way they're taken care of. Wade moved closer, and in the fading light his eyes were intense. Can I ask you something? And I want you to really think about the answer. Beatrice nodded warily. What did you promise yourself? Not your father, not your mother, not this town or society or any of that. But you, Beatrice. What promises did you make to yourself about the life you wanted to live? The question hit her like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to answer and found she had no words. Because the truth was, she'd never promised herself anything. She'd never allowed herself to dream or hope or plan for a future of her own choosing. She'd been so busy being dutiful, being good, being what everyone else needed her to be, that she'd never stopped to consider what she might need. I don't know, she whispered finally. Then maybe it's time you figured that out. Because in 6 weeks, you're going to stand in front of everyone you know and promise your entire life to a man you don't love. Don't you think you owe it to yourself to at least know what you're giving up? Tears stung Beatrice's eyes, but she blinked them back. Why do you care? You don't even know me. Wade was quiet for a moment, as if considering his answer carefully. Maybe because when I look at you, I see someone who deserves better than being traded like currency. Maybe because in the 2 times we've talked, I've seen more life and spirit in you than most people show in a lifetime, and it seems wrong to let that be snuffed out. Or maybe, he paused, his voice dropping lower, maybe because I think if circumstances were different, I'd like to know you better. The admission hung between them, charged with possibility and danger. Beatrice's heart was pounding in her chest, a feeling she'd never experienced with Vincent, never expected to experience at all. Circumstances aren't different, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. They could be. How? Even if I wanted to refuse the marriage, which would ruin my family, where would I go? What would I do? I don't have all the answers, Wade admitted. But running away isn't the only option. Maybe there's a way to pay off your father's debt without sacrificing yourself. Have you asked how much is owed? $5,000. Wade let out a low whistle. That's substantial. Yes, more than I could earn in a lifetime of respectable work. But not impossible, not if you had help. I don't want charity. I'm not offering charity. I'm suggesting that maybe there are people who'd be willing to invest in a better solution than you marrying a man you don't love. Have you talked to anyone else about this? Any other families in town? My father is too proud to ask for help. And most people in Telluride either work for Blackthorn or owe him money themselves. He has this town in his grip. Wade frowned, thinking, there has to be another way. If there is, I haven't found it. Believe me, I've thought about this every day for months. They stood in silence as darkness settled fully over the landscape. Finally, Wade spoke again. What if you just said no? What if you refused to marry him and faced whatever consequences came? My father would be ruined, possibly arrested for unpaid debts. They'd lose everything. But you'd be free. Free to watch my parents suffer because of my selfishness. That's not freedom. That's just a different kind of prison. Wade stepped closer, close enough that she could see the determination in his eyes. What if I told you that I think you deserve to be happy? That I think you should have the chance to choose your own life, even if that life is difficult? What if I said I'd help you, whatever you decided? Why would you do that? You barely know me. Because sometimes you meet someone and you just know they're worth fighting for. And maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I've lost my mind after just a few days in this town, but when I look at you, I see someone worth fighting for. Beatrice felt tears spilling down her cheeks now, unable to hold them back any longer. I can't let you do that. It's too much. You'd make an enemy of the most powerful man in town. I've had worse enemies. You'd lose your job, maybe worse. Jobs are easy to find, but people like you. He reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wanted, and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. People like you are rare. The touch sent a shiver through her entire body. No one had ever touched her with such tenderness, such genuine care. Vincent's touches were possessive, claiming. Her parents' affection was dutiful, obligatory. But this simple gesture from a man she'd known for less than a week, felt like coming home to a place she'd never been. I don't know what to do, she admitted, her voice breaking. Start with the truth. What do you want, Beatrice? Not what you think you should want, not what would be easier for everyone else. What do you want? She looked at him, this cowboy who'd ridden into her life at exactly the wrong moment, or maybe exactly the right one. She thought about her life with Vincent, the years stretching ahead of her like an endless gray corridor. Then she thought about the possibility of something different, something chosen rather than assigned. I want to be free, she said finally. I want to make my own choices. I want to wake up without dread. I want to know what it feels like to be with someone who chose me, not someone who bought me. She paused, then added in a whisper, I want to know what it feels like to be loved. Wade's expression softened even further. You deserve all of that, every bit of it. But wanting something and having it are two different things. Sometimes, but not always. He took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. I know we've only just met. I know this is all happening fast, probably too fast, but I'm asking you to give me some time. Let me see if I can find a solution, some way to help your family without you having to sacrifice yourself. What could you possibly do? I don't know yet. But I'm good with horses, good with numbers, and decent at poker when the situation calls for it. Maybe I can win enough to make a dent in the debt. Maybe I can talk to some of the other miners, see if there's anyone willing to stand up to Blackthorn. Maybe there's something I'm not seeing yet, but I'm asking you not to give up, not yet. The wedding is 6 weeks away. Then we have 6 weeks. Wade, I can't let you risk everything for me. You're not letting me do anything. I'm choosing this. The same way I'm asking you to choose something for yourself. He squeezed her hand gently. I can't promise I'll succeed, but I can promise I'll try. And I can promise that whatever happens, you won't face it alone. Beatrice looked down at their joined hands, at the physical representation of a connection she'd never expected to feel. Part of her screamed that this was madness, that she was being foolish and selfish. But another part, a part that had been silent for so long she'd almost forgotten it existed, was singing with hope. "I need to think," she said finally. "That's fair. Take the time you need, but Beatrice—" He waited until she looked up at him. "Whatever you decide, promise me one thing. Promise yourself that you'll at least consider what you want. Not what you're supposed to want, but what you actually want. Can you do that?" She nodded slowly. "I can try. That's all I'm asking." He released her hand reluctantly. "I should get you back to town before someone comes looking for you." They walked in silence, Wade leading his horse until the lights of Telluride came into view. Before they parted ways, he turned to her once more. "I'll be at the boarding house if you need me. For anything. Even if it's just to talk." "Thank you," Beatrice said softly. "No thanks necessary. Just think about what I asked, about what you promised yourself." She watched him lead his horse toward the boarding house, then made her way home. As she slipped back into her room, she felt different somehow, as if something fundamental had shifted inside her. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt the stirring of something she'd thought was dead. Hope. Over the next few days, Beatrice couldn't stop thinking about Wade's question. What had she promised herself? She went about her duties mechanically, helping at the store, enduring her mother's wedding preparations, sitting through another awkward dinner with Vincent. But all the while, her mind was elsewhere, turning over possibilities she'd never allowed herself to consider before. On Saturday, she saw Wade from a distance, working near the mine entrance as she passed by with her mother on their way to the dressmaker. He was shirtless in the heat, his skin gleaming with sweat as he loaded ore into a cart. He looked up as they passed, and their eyes met for just a moment before Margaret pulled her along, clucking about how improper it was for young ladies to stare at working men. But in that brief glance, Beatrice had seen determination in Wade's eyes, and it strengthened her own resolve. He was fighting for her, fighting for a possibility she'd never dared to hope for. Didn't she owe it to herself to fight too? That evening, she did something she'd never done before. She asked her father to show her the exact terms of his debt to Vincent Blackthorne. Harold looked surprised by the request, but pulled out the papers. Beatrice studied them carefully, her heart sinking as she saw not just the original loan amount but the interest that had accrued, the additional loans taken to cover shortfalls, the cascade of financial decisions that had led them to this point. "You see now why this marriage is necessary," Harold said, his voice heavy. "There's no other way to clear this debt. Blackthorne has been generous to even offer this solution." Generous, Beatrice thought bitterly, as if buying a wife was an act of charity. "What if we sold the store?" she asked. "Use the money to pay him back. The store wouldn't fetch enough, not even close. And then what would we do? How would we survive? We could go back to Kansas City, start over." Harold shook his head. "We have nothing to go back to. This is our life now. And your marriage to Vincent secures not just our present but our future. You'll want for nothing, Beatrice. You'll live in the finest house in town, have servants, beautiful clothes. Many women would envy your position. Many women can have it then." Her father's expression hardened. "Don't be foolish. This is already decided. The wedding is in 5 weeks. Everything is arranged." Beatrice looked at the papers again, at the impossible sum that had bought her future. $5,000. It might as well have been $5 million for all her ability to raise it. That night she returned to the creek, half hoping, half expecting to find Wade there. She wasn't disappointed. He was sitting on the large rock she usually claimed, and he smiled when he saw her approaching. "Was hoping you'd come," he said. "I looked at my father's debt papers today. And it's worse than I thought. The original loan was $2,000, but with interest and additional loans, it's ballooned to over $5,000. There's no way to pay it without Vincent's intervention." Wade nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than defeated. "I've been asking around, being careful about it. Blackthorn has his hands in everything in this town. The mines, the saloons, half the businesses. People are afraid of him. I told you. But here's the thing I learned. He's overextended. He's been buying up so much property and making so many loans that his actual cash reserves are lower than people think. He's built his empire on debt and intimidation. How does that help us? I'm not sure yet, but it's information." Wade stood and walked to where she stood. "I've also been doing some work on the side. There's a ranch about 20 miles from here, needs help breaking horses. I've been riding out there after my shifts at the mine. Owner pays well for good work." "Wade, you can't possibly earn enough in 5 weeks to make a difference in $5,000. Maybe not all of it, but some, and every little bit is something." He reached out and took her hand again, the gesture becoming familiar between them. "I'm not giving up. The question is, are you?" Beatrice felt tears threatening again. "I want to fight. I want to believe there's another way, but I'm scared. Scared of what will happen to my parents if I refuse. Scared of making everything worse. Being scared is natural, but letting fear make all your decisions, that's no way to live. What if we fail? What if we try to fight this and everything falls apart? Then at least we tried. At least you'll know you didn't just surrender without a fight." Wade moved closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "Beatrice, I know this is fast. I know we've only known each other a week, but I need you to know something." Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "What?" "I'm falling for you. Maybe I've already fallen. When I'm working in that mine, I'm thinking about you. When I'm breaking horses, I'm thinking about you. When I try to sleep at night, all I can see is your face, the sadness in your eyes when you talk about your future. And I know I don't have the right to feel this way, that you're promised to another man, but I can't help it. You've gotten under my skin, and I can't imagine just standing by and watching you marry someone else without at least trying to offer you another choice." Beatrice couldn't breathe. No one had ever spoken to her like this, with such raw honesty and emotion. "Wade, You don't have to say anything. I'm not asking you to make any promises. I just need you to know where I stand. And I need you to know that if you decide you want to fight for your freedom, for your life, I'll be right there beside you, whatever it takes." She looked up at him, this man who'd appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she'd been too afraid to say out loud. In the moonlight, his face was open and honest, his eyes reflecting a depth of feeling that took her breath away. "I don't deserve you," she whispered. "You deserve everything," he replied. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle, tentative, nothing like the possessive kisses Vincent had occasionally forced on her. This was a question, not a demand, and Beatrice found herself answering with her whole heart. When they finally pulled apart, she was shaking. "I've never felt like this before, neither have I. But what do we do? Even if we feel this way, even if we want to be together, the situation hasn't changed. My father's debt still exists. Vincent still expects to marry me in 5 weeks." Wade was quiet for a moment, his arms still around her. "What if we went to Vincent directly? Talked to him, tried to negotiate some other arrangement. He won't agree. In his mind, I'm already his. Then what if we went to the territorial marshal, explained the situation, and say what? That my father made a legal arrangement and now I want to back out. There's no law against what's happening. Arranged marriages, deals like this, they happen all the time. That doesn't make it right. No, but it makes it legal." Wade pulled back slightly, frustration clear on his face. "There has to be something we can do, some way to fight this." Beatrice appreciated his determination, but she was more realistic about their options. Unless we can come up with $5,000 in 5 weeks, I don't see how. What if we left, just ran away together? The suggestion hung between them, tempting and terrifying in equal measure. Beatrice had thought about running before, but had always dismissed it as impossible. But now, with Wade standing before her, offering not just escape but companionship, it seemed almost within reach. "My parents," she said finally. "Vincent would take everything from them. Probably have my father arrested. Even if you were gone, especially if I were gone, it would be seen as theft, as breaking a contract. Vincent is vindictive enough to destroy them out of spite." Wade swore softly. "So we're trapped. Unless we can somehow come up with an impossible sum of money in an impossible time frame." Yes. They stood in silence, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. Finally, Wade spoke again, his voice determined despite the odds. "Then I'll work harder, take on more jobs. Maybe I can win some money gambling. There are high-stakes games at the saloon on Friday nights. That's too risky. You could lose what you do have. What choice do we have? Do nothing and watch you marry Blackthorn? I can't do that, Beatrice. I won't." She pressed her forehead against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. I'm sorry you got pulled into this mess. I'm not. Meeting you is the best thing that's happened to me in a long time, maybe ever. Even though it's impossible, nothing's impossible until it's done." They stayed by the creek for another hour, talking quietly about their lives, their dreams, the things they'd hoped for before circumstances had trapped them both. Wade told her about growing up on a small ranch in Wyoming, about losing his parents to illness when he was 19, about drifting from place to place looking for something he couldn't name. Beatrice told him about her younger brother Thomas, who died at 14, about how his loss had broken something in her parents that had never healed. "They're so afraid of losing everything," she said. "They already lost Thomas. The store is all they have left, and I suppose I'm their only hope for security. You're not responsible for their happiness. Maybe not, but I'm responsible for their survival. At least, that's what they've taught me to believe. That's not fair to you. Life isn't fair. You of all people should know that." Wade nodded slowly. "I do, but that doesn't mean we stop fighting for something better." Eventually, they walked back toward town together, Wade's horse trailing behind them. Before they parted, he caught her hand one more time. "I meant what I said earlier. About falling for you, I know." She hesitated, then added, "I think I'm falling for you too. I shouldn't be, but I am." The smile that broke across his face made her heart skip. "Then we'll figure this out somehow. Promise me something. Anything. Don't get yourself killed trying to help me. If things get dangerous, walk away. I couldn't bear it if you were hurt because of me. I can't promise that, but I can promise I'll be careful." It wasn't the promise she wanted, but she knew it was the only one he could make. They said goodnight, and Beatrice returned home with her mind churning. She was in love with a cowboy she'd known for barely more than a week. She was engaged to a man who terrified her. Her wedding was 5 weeks away, and she had no idea how to reconcile any of it. The following week passed in a blur of contradictions. By day, Beatrice maintained her facade of the dutiful bride-to-be, enduring Vincent's visits and her mother's excited planning. But at night, she met Wade by the creek, and those stolen hours felt like the only real moments of her life. They talked about everything and nothing. Wade taught her about horses, about reading the land, about survival skills he'd learned in his years of drifting. She told him about books she'd read, dreams she'd had of seeing the ocean, small rebellions she'd never dared to voice before. And they kissed, long and deep, with a growing passion that both frightened and exhilarated her. Being with Wade felt right in a way nothing else in her life had. With him, she wasn't a commodity or a solution to a financial problem. She was just Beatrice, a woman discovering what it meant to be truly seen and valued. But underneath, the joy of their growing connection was a ticking clock. 4 weeks until the wedding. 3 weeks. The time was slipping away like water through her fingers. Wade was true to his word, working himself nearly to exhaustion. He pulled shifts at the mine, then rode out to the ranch to break horses, then sometimes played poker in the saloons late at night. Beatrice worried about him constantly, seeing the fatigue in his eyes during their meetings. "You're going to collapse," she told him one night, noticing the dark circles under his eyes. "I'm fine." "You're not. Wade, you can't keep this up." "I've saved almost $400, he said, pride in his voice despite his exhaustion. "It's not enough, not nearly, but it's something." $400. Beatrice's heart sank. It was an impressive sum for a working man to save in such a short time, but against 5,000 it was a drop in the bucket. "It's too much," she said. "You're killing yourself for nothing." Wade's jaw tightened. "It's not nothing. Every dollar is $1 closer to your freedom. At this rate, we'd need years, not weeks. Then we'll find another way. Maybe I can talk to the bank, see if they'd issue a loan. To a minor, with no collateral, they'll laugh you out the door. Maybe I can win big at poker. Or lose everything you've saved." Wade ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "So what do you want me to do? Give up? Accept that you're going to marry him?" "I don't know." Beatrice's voice broke. "I don't know what I want you to do. I don't want you to give up, but I also don't want you to destroy yourself for a hopeless cause." "You're not hopeless. This situation is." They stood in tense silence, the strain of the past weeks catching up with them. Finally, Wade spoke more quietly. "I know the odds are against us. I know that chances are, 3 weeks from now, you'll be standing in that church marrying Vincent Blackthorne. But I can't just do nothing. I can't watch the woman I love be sold to the highest bidder without trying everything possible to stop it." Beatrice's breath caught. "You love me?" Wade met her eyes steadily. "Yes, I know it's too soon, that we've only known each other a few weeks, but yes, I love you, Beatrice, and that means I fight for you until there's no fight left." She crossed the space between them in 2 quick strides and kissed him fiercely. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "I love you, and it's the worst timing in the world, but I do." They held each other as the creek burbled beside them, 2 people caught in an impossible situation with no clear way out. But for that moment, none of it mattered. They had each other, and they had love, and sometimes that had to be enough. The next morning, Beatrice was helping her mother inventory linens when Vincent arrived at the house unexpectedly. He looked pleased with himself, a quality that immediately put Beatrice on edge. "I have wonderful news," he announced after exchanging pleasantries with Margaret. "I've purchased a house in Denver. After we're married, we'll split our time between here and there. Much more cultured society in Denver, better for the wife of a man of my standing." Beatrice felt her stomach turn. Denver, even further from any life she might have chosen for herself. "That's very generous," Margaret gushed. "Isn't it wonderful, Beatrice?" "Wonderful," she echoed hollowly. Vincent studied her, and she saw a glint of suspicion in his eyes. "You seem less than enthusiastic." "I'm just overwhelmed by all the changes." "You'll adapt. Women do." He stepped closer, his hand coming up to grip her chin in a gesture that appeared affectionate but felt controlling. "You understand that once we're married, I'll expect certain things. Obedience, loyalty, absolute discretion. My business dealings aren't always entirely above board, and I need a wife who knows when to keep her mouth shut." The casual admission of criminality, spoken right in front of her mother, took Beatrice's breath away. Margaret, of course, heard nothing wrong with it, too blinded by the prospect of having her daughter married to wealth. "Of course she understands," Margaret said quickly. Beatrice knows her duties. Vincent released her chin, but his eyes remained hard. I hope so. It would be unfortunate if there were any problems after we're married. Fortunate for everyone that your father's debt will be forgiven, though. It would be such a shame if anything happened to change that arrangement. The threat was clear, even if unspoken. Obey, or your father pays the price. After Vincent left, Beatrice felt physically ill. She'd known he was cruel, but hearing him speak so casually about his expectations, about his willingness to use her father's debt as a weapon, made everything more real and more terrifying. That night, she met Wade as usual, but her despair must have shown on her face because he pulled her into his arms immediately. What happened? She told him about Vincent's visit, about the house in Denver, about the barely veiled threats. Wade's expression grew darker with every word. We're running out of time, he said finally. 3 weeks and you'll be his wife. I can't let that happen, Beatrice, I won't. What choice do we have? Wade was quiet for a long moment, and she could practically see him working through options in his mind. Finally, he spoke, his voice careful. What if we talked to Vincent directly, told him the truth? That you don't want to marry him, that you're in love with someone else? He won't care. Maybe not, but what if we offered him something else? What if I promised to pay back your father's debt with interest over time? Set up a payment plan. Vincent doesn't need more money. He needs control. That's what this marriage is really about, showing everyone in town that he can take whatever he wants. Wade swore softly. Then we need to take away his control. How? I don't know yet, but there has to be a way. Maybe if we could find evidence of his illegal dealings, threaten to expose him. That would just make him more dangerous, and he'd still ruin my father out of spite. They were going in circles, and both of them knew it. Every solution led back to the same impossible problem. $5,000 they didn't have, and a powerful man who held all the cards. Maybe, Beatrice said slowly, the words painful to speak. Maybe we should just accept that this isn't going to work out the way we want. Wade's arms tightened around her. No, don't say that. But it's true. We've been fighting for weeks and we're no closer to a solution. Maybe the kind thing, the smart thing, is to accept reality. The reality where you marry a man you don't love. Where you spend the rest of your life being miserable, that reality. At least my parents would be safe. At least the debt would be cleared. And what about you? What about what you want? Sometimes what we want doesn't matter. Wade pulled back to look at her, and there were tears in his eyes. It matters to me. You matter to me. And I know you're scared. I know this seems impossible, but please don't give up. Not yet. What's the alternative? Keep hoping for a miracle that isn't coming, if that's what it takes, yes. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumb stroking her cheek. I found you, didn't I? Out of all the towns I could have ridden into, all the places I could have gone, I ended up here. I ended up finding you. If that's not a miracle, I don't know what is. So maybe we're due for one more. Beatrice wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that somehow, despite the impossible odds, things would work out. But she was also a realist, and reality was crushing. I love you, she said, her voice breaking. But love doesn't pay debts. Love doesn't stop a man like Vincent Blackthorne. Maybe not alone, but with determination and a little luck, maybe it's enough. They stayed together until nearly dawn, neither wanting to let go, both aware that time was slipping away from them. When they finally parted, Beatrice felt as if she were leaving a piece of herself behind. The next 2 weeks were agony. The wedding preparations reached a fever pitch. The dress was finished. The church was reserved. Invitations had been sent to everyone of importance in Telluride and the surrounding towns. Beatrice felt like she was watching her own funeral being planned. She continued to meet Wade whenever she could, but their conversations were strained, overshadowed by the approaching date. Wade had saved nearly $600, an amount that would have seemed impressive under any other circumstances but was woefully inadequate now. "1 week," Beatrice said one night, the words like ash in her mouth. "1 week and I'll be married." Wade looked haggard, the strain of the past weeks evident in every line of his face. "I failed you." "No, you tried. That's more than anyone else has ever done. Trying isn't enough." "Maybe not, but it matters. You matter, Wade. These past weeks being with you, feeling what it's like to be truly loved, it's been the best thing in my life. Even if it ends badly, I'll never regret it. Don't talk like it's over. Isn't it?" Wade looked at her with such intensity that she almost stepped back. "I have one more idea. It's risky, possibly illegal, and could blow up in our faces, but it's all I've got left." "What is it?" "I'd rather not say until I know if it'll work, but if it does, it could solve everything." "And if it doesn't?" "Then at least I tried everything possible." Beatrice felt a chill of fear. "Wade, don't do anything that could get you arrested or killed." "I'll be careful. But I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" She looked at this man who'd turned her world upside down in the span of a few weeks, who'd shown her what it meant to be truly seen and valued. "Yes, I trust you." "Then give me until Saturday, 2 days before your wedding. If I haven't figured something out by then, we'll accept defeat. But until then, let me try." Beatrice nodded, though fear gnawed at her insides. "What are you planning?" "Better you don't know. That way, if things go wrong, you can honestly say you weren't involved." That didn't reassure her at all, but she could see the determination in his eyes and knew there was no talking him out of whatever he'd planned. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise." They parted that night with a sense of finality hanging over them. Beatrice went home and lay awake in her bed, wondering what Wade was planning, terrified that whatever it was would end with him hurt or worse. The next day was Friday, and Beatrice went through her usual routine in a daze. She helped at the store, sat through her mother's endless last-minute wedding discussions, and tried not to think about Wade. Vincent stopped by in the evening, and she endured his company, his possessive touches, his talk of their future together. "Just 2 more days," he said, running a finger down her arm in a way that made her skin crawl. "2 more days and you'll finally be mine, officially." "Yes," she managed. "I've been very patient, you know. Some men wouldn't have waited so long to claim their property. But I wanted everything to be proper, to give you time to adjust to your new reality." His property. The words made her want to vomit. After he left, Beatrice felt suffocated by her own life. She needed to see Wade, needed to know he was all right, needed to ground herself in the only real thing she had left. She slipped out of the house and made her way to the boarding house on 3rd Street. Mrs. Chen, the proprietor, was suspicious when Beatrice asked for Wade, but when she saw the desperation on the younger woman's face, she softened. "He left this morning, miss. Didn't say where he was going, but he packed a bag. Said he'd be back by tomorrow night." Gone. Wade was gone, off doing whatever risky, possibly illegal thing he'd planned, and Beatrice had no idea where he was or if he was safe. She thanked Mrs. Chen and walked back home in a fog of worry. That night was the longest of her life. She lay awake, imagining every possible disaster. Wade arrested. Wade hurt. Wade killed by one of Vincent's men. By dawn, she was exhausted and terrified, but no closer to any answers. Saturday morning brought preparations for the final dress fitting and last-minute details for the wedding on Monday. Beatrice moved through it all like a ghost, barely present, her mind fixed on Wade. Where was he? Was he safe? What had he done? She found out that evening. Beatrice was sitting in the parlor with her mother when there was a commotion outside. Shouting, the sound of horses, people running. She looked out the window and saw a crowd gathering near the main street. Something big had happened. Harold burst through the door, his face flushed with excitement. "Beatrice, Margaret, you won't believe what's happened. Vincent Blackthorne has been arrested by the territorial marshal." The world seemed to tilt. What? Arrested? Apparently, someone provided evidence of his involvement in claim jumping and fraud. Detailed records of how he's been stealing mining claims from legitimate prospectors, falsifying documents. The marshal rode in from Denver this morning with a warrant. They're taking him to Denver for trial. Beatrice's heart was pounding. Wade, it had to be Wade. But how? What about the wedding? Margaret asked, her voice high with panic. Obviously, it's postponed, at least until we sort out what this means for the debt. Beatrice's mind was racing. Vincent arrested meant no wedding, at least not on Monday. But it didn't solve the debt problem. Unless she had to find Wade. She excused herself, ignoring her mother's protests, and ran toward the boarding house. Mrs. Chen told her he'd returned an hour ago and directed her to his room. Beatrice didn't care about propriety anymore. She ran up the stairs and knocked on his door. Wade opened it, looking tired but unharmed. His face broke into a relieved smile when he saw her. "Beatrice, I was just about to come find you." She threw herself into his arms. "What did you do?" "Vincent's been arrested." Wade pulled her inside and closed the door. "I rode to Denver. Spent the last day and a half digging through land office records. Blackthorne's been operating his scheme for years, but he's been sloppy. Left a paper trail if you knew where to look. I gathered all the evidence I could and took it straight to the marshal. He was already suspicious of Blackthorne but hadn't had enough to move on. What I gave him was enough for a warrant. Wade, that was so dangerous if Vincent had found out. He didn't, and now he's facing serious charges. He'll probably spend years in prison if they can make everything stick." Beatrice pulled back to look at him. "But what about my father's debt?" Wade's expression grew more serious. "That's the tricky part. Legally, the debt still exists. But here's what I'm hoping. With Blackthorne arrested, his assets will likely be frozen pending investigation. That includes the loan documents. In the chaos, there might be an opportunity to challenge the debt, especially if we can prove any part of it was acquired through illegal means or inflated through fraud. That's a big if. It is. But it's better than where we were 2 days ago. At minimum, you don't have to marry him on Monday." Beatrice felt tears of relief streaming down her face. "I can't believe you did this. You could have been killed. You're worth the risk." Wade cupped her face, wiping away her tears. "I know the debt isn't completely resolved yet. But we've bought time, and Vincent won't be able to enforce the marriage arrangement from a jail cell. That gives us options we didn't have before." She kissed him then, pouring every ounce of gratitude and love into it. When they finally pulled apart, she was breathless. "What happens now?" "Now we wait and see what shakes out from Vincent's arrest. I've already talked to a lawyer in town, paid him a retainer with the money I saved. He's going to look into your father's debt, see if there are any grounds to challenge or reduce it. With Vincent facing criminal charges, we might be able to argue that some of the terms were extortion. And if that doesn't work," Wade took her hand, "then we figure out the next step. Maybe your father can negotiate a payment plan with whoever takes over Vincent's estate. Maybe we can get the debt reduced to something manageable. I don't know all the answers yet, Beatrice, but we're in a better position than we were." She nodded, allowing herself to feel hope for the first time in months. Thank you for not giving up. I never could, not on you." There was a knock at the door, and Wade tensed. He opened it to find Harold Garrett standing in the hallway, his expression a mixture of confusion and anger. "Beatrice, what are you doing in this man's room?" She straightened her shoulders, making a decision in that moment that changed everything. "Papa, this is Wade Morrison, and I'm in love with him." Harold's face went red. "Have you lost your mind? You're engaged to be married in 2 days. Vincent Blackthorne is in jail, Beatrice said calmly. There isn't going to be a wedding. That's temporary. Once this misunderstanding is cleared up. It's not a misunderstanding, sir, Wade interjected. Blackthorne is guilty of multiple crimes. He won't be marrying your daughter or anyone else for a long time. Harold looked between them, realization dawning. You did this. You got him arrested. I provided evidence of his crimes to the proper authorities. He got himself arrested through his own actions. But the debt? What about the debt? Without the marriage, Blackthorne will demand full payment immediately. He's in no position to demand anything, Wade said. And I've retained a lawyer to look into the terms of your agreement. There may be legal avenues to challenge it. With what money? I can't afford a lawyer. I can, Wade said simply. I've been working multiple jobs and saving every penny. It's not enough to pay off the debt entirely, but it's enough to fight this legally. Harold looked at his daughter, and she saw the moment he truly understood what was happening. You're choosing him over your family, over our security. I'm choosing myself, Papa. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing what I want. And yes, that includes Wade. You're a fool. Without Blackthorne's protection, we're ruined. Maybe, Beatrice said. Or maybe we find another way. But I won't sacrifice my entire life, my happiness, my future, to fix a problem I didn't create. You made the deal with Vincent. You took the loans. I'm sorry for the position you're in, but I won't be the currency you used to pay for it. Harold stared at her as if seeing a stranger. Then, without another word, he turned and left. Wade closed the door and turned to Beatrice. Are you all right? She was shaking but also felt strangely free. I think so. That's the first time I've ever truly stood up to him. How does it feel? Terrifying, but also right. She looked up at Wade. What do we do now? Now we let the lawyer do his work. We wait to see what happens with Blackthorne's trial, and we figure out our next steps together. Together, Beatrice repeated, liking the sound of that word. Over the next few weeks, Telluride was in upheaval. Vincent Blackthorne's arrest had exposed a network of corruption and fraud that reached far beyond anyone had suspected. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered evidence of stolen claims, falsified documents, and extortion stretching back years. Many people in town discovered that debts they thought were legitimate were actually based on fraudulent terms. Harold Garrett's debt was one of them. The lawyer Wade had hired proved that Vincent had artificially inflated the interest rates and added phantom fees that weren't in the original agreement. When all was said and done, the actual amount owed was less than half of what Vincent had claimed. It was still a substantial sum, over $2,000, but it was manageable. The store was doing well, and with careful financial planning, Harold could pay it off over time to whichever bank or entity ended up with Vincent's legitimate assets. Harold and Margaret didn't forgive Beatrice immediately. They were hurt and angry, feeling betrayed that she'd chosen her own happiness over their security. But as the weeks passed, and the full extent of Vincent's crimes became public knowledge, they began to understand how close they'd come to trading their daughter's life for a snake's promises. Slowly, grudgingly, a fragile peace developed. It would take time to fully heal the rift, but at least they were speaking again. Wade continued working at the mine, but he also started helping at the ranch more regularly. The owner, impressed with his horse skills, offered him a permanent position with better pay and a small cabin on the property. It wasn't much, but it was a start. 3 months after Vincent's arrest, Wade asked Beatrice to marry him properly, without debts or coercion or anyone's agenda but their own. They were sitting by their creek, the place where they'd first truly talked, and he got down on one knee with a simple silver ring he'd saved up to buy. I don't have much to offer you, he said. Just a cowboy's wages and a small cabin. But I love you, Beatrice. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. And I promise to spend every day of my life making sure you never regret choosing yourself, choosing us. Will you marry me?" Through tears of joy, she said yes. They were married in September in the same church where she would have married Vincent, but this time, everything was different. This time, she walked down the aisle toward a man who loved her, who'd fought for her, who saw her as a partner rather than property. Her parents attended, still somewhat stiff and uncomfortable but present. Mrs. Chen from the boarding house was there, beaming. The ranch owner, Jack Sullivan, stood as Wade's best man, and the lawyer, Samuel Pierce, attended with his wife. It was a small ceremony, nothing like the elaborate production her mother had planned for the wedding to Vincent. But it was real and it was theirs, and that made it perfect. Their first year of marriage wasn't easy. Money was tight, and they lived simply in Wade's small cabin. But Beatrice had never been happier. She helped Wade with the horses, learning to ride properly, to understand the animals in the way he did. She also started a small business making and selling preserves from wild berries she gathered in the mountains. It wasn't much, but it was hers, something she'd built with her own hands. Wade continued to work hard, but now it was for their future together, not to save her from someone else's plans. They talked about everything, planned together, dreamed together. Sometimes they still went to the creek at night, just to remember how it all started. Harold slowly came to respect Wade, recognizing the quality of character beneath the cowboy exterior. Margaret took longer, still harboring resentment that Beatrice hadn't married into wealth, but even she eventually admitted that her daughter seemed happier than she'd ever been. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant. Wade was overjoyed, already planning for the baby, talking about teaching their child to ride and read and think for themselves. Their son was born that November, healthy and loud and perfect. They named him Thomas, after Beatrice's lost brother, a gesture that finally bridged the remaining gap with her parents. Harold and Margaret doted on their grandson, and through him, learned to fully accept Wade as part of the family. 3 years later, they had a daughter they named Sarah, and 2 years after that, another son named Henry. The cabin grew crowded, and Wade built an addition, then eventually a whole new house on a piece of land they were able to purchase with savings and a legitimate loan from the bank. Vincent Blackthorne was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 20 years in prison. His empire was dismantled, his assets sold off to pay restitution to his victims. Telluride slowly recovered, freed from his controlling influence. Beatrice sometimes thought about how different her life could have been. If Wade hadn't ridden into town that night, if she hadn't gone to the creek, if she hadn't found the courage to ask herself what she really wanted. But she had done those things, and Wade had done his part, and together they'd fought for something real. Their life wasn't glamorous. They worked hard, worried about money sometimes, faced all the challenges that came with building a life from scratch. But it was theirs, chosen freely, built on love and respect and partnership. On their 10th anniversary, Wade took Beatrice back to the creek where they'd first really talked. Their children were staying with Harold and Margaret for the night, giving them rare time alone. "Do you remember the question I asked you here?" Wade said as they sat on the familiar rock. "About what I promised myself?" "Yes. Do you have an answer now?" Beatrice thought about it, about the decade that had passed, about the life they'd built together. "I promised myself that I would never let someone else define my worth, that I would choose my own path, even if it was harder, that I would love and be loved for who I really am, not for what I could provide to someone else." that I would raise my children to think for themselves and have the courage to choose their own happiness. Wade pulled her close. And have you kept those promises? Every single day. She looked up at him, this man who changed everything by asking one simple question. Thank you for making me think about it, for making me believe I deserve to have promises to myself. You deserved all of it. You always did. They sat together as the sun set over the mountains, the creek running beside them just as it had a decade ago. Their life had been built on a foundation of choosing themselves, of having the courage to fight for what mattered, and of asking the right questions at the right time. Beatrice had been promised to another man, but Wade had asked her what she promised herself. And in answering that question, she'd found not just love, but freedom, purpose, and a life truly her own. Years continued to pass, each one adding new layers to their story. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man with his father's way with horses and his mother's sharp mind. Sarah was spirited and independent, determined to make her own mark on the world. Henry was the dreamer of the family, always sketching in a journal Wade had bought him, capturing the mountains and valleys of their Colorado home. Wade's reputation as a horseman grew, and ranchers from across the region sought his expertise. He never got rich, but he made enough to provide comfortably for his family, and more importantly, he loved his work. Beatrice's preserve business expanded beyond her wildest expectations, with stores in multiple towns selling her products. She'd even begun writing a small handbook on foraging and preservation techniques that was popular with other frontier women. Harold eventually sold the store and retired, admitting to Beatrice one evening that he was sorry for the position he'd put her in all those years ago. I was scared, he told her, scared of losing everything, of not being able to provide. I convinced myself that your security mattered more than your happiness. I was wrong. The apology healed something deep in Beatrice, allowing her to finally, fully forgive her father. Margaret, in her own way, also made amends, becoming a devoted grandmother who spoiled the children and never again suggested that wealth mattered more than love. The cabin that had started as Wade's bachelor quarters transformed over the years into a true home, filled with laughter and life and love. They added rooms as children came, then later converted one into a workspace for Beatrice's preserve business. The walls were decorated with Henry's drawings, Sarah's ribbons from horse races she won, and a framed copy of the letter Thomas wrote that got published in the territorial newspaper about sustainable ranching practices. On their 20th anniversary, Wade surprised Beatrice with a trip. He'd saved carefully, planning in secret, and in early summer they traveled to California. For 5 days, they stood on the beaches Beatrice had once dreamed about, watching the Pacific Ocean roll endlessly toward the horizon. She cried when she first saw it, overwhelmed by the realization that dreams she'd once thought impossible had come true. I never thought I'd actually see it, she told Wade as they walked along the sand. Why not? Because girls like me, from small towns with limited means, we don't get to see the ocean. We don't get to choose our own adventures. Wade took her hand. You're not that girl anymore. You're a woman who chose her own life, built her own business, raised 3 incredible children, and never stopped fighting for what mattered. You're the kind of woman who deserves to see every ocean in the world if she wants to. They spent their days exploring the coast and their nights talking about everything and nothing, just like they had by the creek all those years ago. It was a second honeymoon, a celebration not just of their marriage but of the life they'd built together against all odds. When Thomas turned 21, he announced that he wanted to start his own ranch. Wade helped him find property, taught him everything he knew, and stepped back to let his son build something of his own. It was hard, watching his firstborn strike out independently, but Wade understood the importance of letting children choose their own paths. Sarah, true to her independent nature, decided she wanted to become a teacher. She moved to Denver for training, writing long letters home about the city and her studies. Beatrice was proud of her daughter's ambition, seeing in Sarah the same determination to forge her own way that had driven her own choices 2 decades earlier. Henry's artistic talents led him in yet another direction. A traveling photographer came through Telluride when Henry was 19 and was so impressed with the young man's eye for composition that he offered an apprenticeship. Henry left with the photographer, promising to return home regularly, his journals filled with sketches that would inform his future photographs. The house grew quiet with the children gone, but Wade and Beatrice found they enjoyed the peace. They'd raised 3 strong, independent people who knew how to think for themselves and choose their own happiness. It was the legacy they'd hoped to leave. On a warm evening in their 30th year of marriage, they returned once more to the creek. They were older now, with silver threading through their hair and lines marking their faces, but their hands still fit together perfectly. Their hearts still beat in sync. "You ever regret it?" Wade asked. "Choosing this life over the security you would have had with Blackthorn?" Beatrice laughed. "Vincent was sentenced to 20 years in prison. I would have had security for maybe 6 months before his entire world collapsed. Beyond that, no, never, not for a single moment. Even when money was tight, when we were struggling, especially then. Because we were struggling together, building something real. Vincent would have given me wealth but taken my soul. You gave me freedom and partnership. There's no comparison." Wade pulled her close. "I still remember the first time I saw you, sitting right here on this rock, looking like the weight of the world was on your shoulders. I remember a cowboy on a horse, offering help to a stranger. Best decision I ever made, stopping to talk to you." "Second best," Beatrice corrected. "The best was asking me what I promised myself." "That worked out pretty well, didn't it?" She kissed him, long and slow, with the comfort of 3 decades of love behind it. "Better than well. It worked out perfectly." As they sat by the creek, watching the stars emerge in the Colorado sky, Beatrice reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She'd been promised to another man, a transaction intended to solve her father's problems while ignoring her own needs and dreams. But Wade had asked her the one question that changed everything. What did she promise herself in answering that question? In finding the courage to honor those promises to herself, she discovered a life richer than anything she could have imagined. Not rich in money or social standing, but rich in love, in purpose, in the deep satisfaction of living authentically. Their children had grown strong and independent because they'd seen their parents model courage and authenticity. Their marriage had lasted through hardship and joy because it was built on genuine love and mutual respect. Their community had become better because they'd stood up to corruption and injustice. All because a cowboy had asked the right question at the right time, and a young woman had found the courage to answer honestly. Years continued to unfold. Thomas's ranch prospered, and he married a kind woman named Elizabeth who reminded Wade of a younger Beatrice. They gave Wade and Beatrice 5 grandchildren who spent summers learning to ride and forage and think for themselves. Sarah returned from Denver with a teaching certificate and opened a school in Telluride, focusing on educating both boys and girls equally, a radical idea that Beatrice fully supported. She never married, declaring that she was perfectly happy dedicating her life to shaping young minds. Beatrice understood and respected her daughter's choice, having learned long ago that happiness took many forms. Henry's photography gained recognition, and his images of the American West were displayed in galleries in San Francisco and New York. He traveled extensively but always returned home to Colorado, to the mountains and valleys that had shaped his artistic vision. He eventually married a fellow artist, and they built a life that was unconventional but deeply fulfilling. Wade and Beatrice grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They maintained their tradition of visiting the creek on significant occasions, finding peace in the spot where their story had truly begun. On their 40th anniversary, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and friends, Wade raised a glass at the celebration dinner. 40 years ago, I met a woman sitting by a creek, and I asked her what she promised herself. She didn't have an answer then, but she spent the last 4 decades living that answer every single day. To Beatrice, the woman who taught me that the best promises are the ones we make to ourselves and have the courage to keep. Everyone raised their glasses, and Beatrice felt tears streaming down her face, tears of joy and gratitude and deep contentment. She looked around at the life she'd built, at the people who filled it with love and laughter, and knew that every struggle, every hard choice, every moment of courage had been worth it. That night, lying in bed beside Wade, she thought about the young woman she'd been at 22, so trapped and frightened, unable to imagine a different future. If she could go back and tell that girl anything, what would it be? That it would be okay. That having the courage to ask yourself hard questions was the first step toward freedom. That love, real love, was worth fighting for. That the opinions of society mattered far less than living authentically. That her life belonged to her, and she had the right to choose how to live it. But that girl had figured it all out eventually, with the help of a cowboy who'd seen her worth when she'd almost forgotten it herself. Wade stirred beside her. Can't sleep, just thinking. About what? About how grateful I am, for you, for our life, for everything. Wade pulled her closer. I'm the grateful one. You took a chance on a drifting cowboy with nothing but determination and a beat-up horse. You had much more than that. You had integrity and courage and a good heart, still do. Well, you brought out the best in me. Made me want to be the kind of man worthy of your love. You always were. You just helped me see I was worthy of love too. They drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, comfortable and content, knowing that whatever time they had left would be spent together, still choosing each other every day. In their 51st year of marriage, Wade fell ill. The doctors said his heart was giving out, worn down by a lifetime of hard work and high altitude. He was 74 years old and had lived a full life, but Beatrice wasn't ready to let him go. She tended him carefully through the winter, and when spring came, he rallied slightly. On the first warm day, he asked her to take him to the creek one last time. Their grandson Thomas Jr., named for Beatrice's brother, and now a strong young man of 25, carried Wade to the spot. Beatrice sat beside her husband on their rock, holding his hand, surrounded by the sounds of running water and birdsong. Remember the first time we met here? Wade asked, his voice weak but clear, every detail. You were so fierce, so sad but so fierce. I knew right then you were someone special. You saved me. Wade shook his head slightly. No, you saved yourself. I just asked the right question. The perfect question. Beatrice squeezed his hand gently. What I promised myself. I've tried to honor those promises every day of our life together. You have. And you've helped me keep my promises too. To love you fully, to support your dreams, to build a life based on choice rather than obligation. They sat in silence for a while, just being together in the place where it all started. Finally, Wade spoke again. I need to ask you something. Anything. Are you happy? Looking back on everything, knowing that you could have had an easier life, more comfort, less struggle, are you happy with how things turned out? Beatrice looked at this man who'd been her partner for over 5 decades, who'd fought for her, believed in her, loved her through every season of life. She thought about their children and grandchildren, about the business she'd built, about the autonomy and authenticity she'd claimed for herself. "I am happier than I ever dreamed possible," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave me the greatest gift anyone could give, the encouragement to choose myself, to honor my own promises. Everything good in my life flows from that moment when you asked me that question." Wade smiled, tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. "Good. That's all I needed to know. That you're happy, that it was all worth it. It was worth everything. You are worth everything." He closed his eyes, content, and Beatrice held his hand as the creek burbled beside them, just as it had 51 years ago when a cowboy had stopped to talk to a desperate young woman and changed both their lives forever. Wade passed away peacefully 3 days later, surrounded by family, having lived long enough to see his children grown, his grandchildren thriving, and his wife happy. The entire community turned out for his funeral, testament to the respect he'd earned through decades of honest work and kind treatment of others. Beatrice grieved deeply, but not with regret. She'd had 51 years of genuine love, of partnership, of building a life that mattered. Many people never got even a fraction of that. She continued living in their home, tending the garden, helping Thomas run his expanding ranch, advising Sarah at her school, and displaying Henry's photographs with pride. Her grandchildren visited often, and she made sure to ask each of them the question Wade had once asked her. "What do you promise yourself?" Some had answers ready. Others needed time to think. But all of them learned the importance of that question, of knowing their own minds and hearts, of having the courage to choose themselves. On what would have been their 55th anniversary, Beatrice returned to the creek alone. She was 77 years old, her hair silver, her body bent with age, but her mind was still sharp and her heart still full. She sat on the rock and spoke to Wade as if he were still there. "I kept my promises, love. The ones I made to myself and the ones I made to you. I lived authentically. I chose my own path. I built something meaningful, and I loved you with everything I had until the very end and beyond." The creek answered with its eternal song, and Beatrice felt peace settle over her like a blanket. She'd been promised to another man once, so long ago it felt like another lifetime. But a cowboy had asked her what she promised herself, and in answering that question, she'd found her true life. She'd promised herself freedom, and she'd claimed it. She'd promised herself choice, and she'd exercised it. She'd promised herself the chance to be loved for who she really was, and Wade had given her that gift every day of their marriage. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Beatrice felt grateful for every moment, every struggle, every joy. Her life had been difficult at times, but it had been hers, lived on her own terms, built on her own promises to herself. And in the end, that made all the difference. Beatrice lived to see her 80th birthday, celebrated surrounded by 3 children, 12 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren. She passed away peacefully in her sleep on a warm summer night, in the home she and Wade had built together, having lived a life that was fully and completely her own. At her funeral, Sarah read from a letter Beatrice had written to each of her children, to be opened after her death. The words were simple but powerful. "I was once promised to a man I didn't love to satisfy a debt I didn't owe, but someone asked me what I promised myself, and that question changed everything. I promised myself freedom, choice, authenticity, and love. I kept those promises." Now I ask you to make your own promises to yourselves and have the courage to keep them, no matter what obstacles you face. That is my legacy to you, not wealth or status, but the example of a life lived with intention and courage. Choose yourselves, always. The words resonated through generations, becoming a family motto that guided Beatrice and Wade's descendants in their own choices and challenges. The story of how they met, how they fought against impossible odds, how they built a life based on love and mutual respect rather than obligation and transaction, was told and retold, inspiring others to ask themselves that crucial question: what did you promise yourself? And so the legacy continued, rippling outward through time, all because a cowboy had asked the right question, and a young woman had found the courage to answer honestly. Their love story became a testament to the power of choosing yourself, of honoring your own promises, of fighting for authentic happiness rather than accepting what others decided for you. In the end, that was the real promise, that it's never too late to ask yourself what you really want, and it's always worth the fight to claim the life you deserve.